Hi guys, welcome back to Gardening with Creations by DX & Co. Today we're actually going to talk about another part of our garden planning series, which is actually mapping out your garden. Very important step to planning your garden. So let's get started today. So what do I mean by mapping out your garden? Well, I do mean actually drawing it out on paper, mapping out where your plants are actually going to go, spacing, what crops are going to go where, right? So on and so forth. So we're going to go through some of that today, how I map out my garden, and I'll go through the process with you guys as we go along and show you exactly on paper the do's and don'ts of it. Now, what does it mean to map out your garden? Well, it literally means just to draw your garden in a way that is detailing out exactly where your beds are, where your crops are definitely going to go, how the sun or shade hits your garden, and so on and so forth. And ideally, you're going to find, whether or not you have enough space for what you need to grow. And if you need to look at maybe expanding your garden, or maybe this isn't the right spot for your garden. So whether this be your first year gardening or you've been in the gardening for 50 plus years, it's always a great idea to map your garden. You may do this in your head every year, but I find that a lot of people like to really draw it out, map it down on paper. And so let me show you exactly how I do mine, and you can choose to see if this is a good fit for you to do it this way. Let's get started. Okay. So the first thing you want to do, get a blank piece of paper, a ruler if you have one, or a straight edge of some sort. Ruler is great, especially if you've measured your garden, which would be ideal if you're measuring the plot or the area that your garden is. Some of you may know it off the top of your head if you're doing raised beds and you already know the measurements of your raised bed. Keep in mind, the outside measurement of your raised bed doesn't always equal the inside measurement of your raised bed, so something to consider there. Also, you're going to need a pencil. I recommend a pencil and not a pen, because you will occasionally want to erase a plant that you put there, maybe because spacing just doesn't feel right, so on and so forth. I recommend a ruler with inches or millimeters, however you're going to map it out, just so that way you can get the spacing right on your actual beds. So what I'm going to do here is, I'll probably speed up this part of the video for you, but what I want to do is actually start by drawing my beds. I know the angle's kind of weird here, guys. I apologize with the camera angle, but I'll show you as I'm going along here. So let me start by getting this mapped out here. So I know that the back of my garden area is a square. It's about 22 feet across, but my picture is only, or my paper is 8 by 11, so it's 11, so roughly 22 feet. So I know that basically 1 inch is gonna account for 2 feet. So pretty simple math there. Now it's about 3 foot deep. So what I want to do here is make probably my first mark on my bed. Since I know that I'm averaging 1 inch is 2 feet, then I'm going to look at saying it's about 3 feet. I'm going to go with about 1.5 inches would give me my standpoint. So I'm going to do that, 1.5 inches. And so I just did some quick measurements. You guys can probably do it however you want it. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it is going to play a big factor at the end of this when you start mapping out your crops. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is draw my line across. So this is my back bed. Now traditionally I've done peppers and cucumbers in this bed, because I also have a chain link fence. I'm just gonna indicate that with X's, so I know that's a chain link fence. I'm just gonna, just for my own sake, understanding visually that this is a chain link fence. Now, it's also important to draw in other features in here, and I'll explain why. So I've got X's across the back. That's my chain link fence. Here's my bed that's slightly raised. I've got a border there. And then I've got a pathway in between that and my next bed. Now, the reason I say it's important is because I also have a Rose of Sharon here and a Rose of Sharon here. So I want to draw just some circle here. I probably should know the exact measurement of how far away from the house and the other fence they are, but there we go. So I'm indicating those are my Rose of Sharon bushes. I can even write in there rose, rose, right, just so I know what I've plotted out here. I've drawn them a little larger circles to know that they're a larger crop. Now, my neighbor, this butts up right up to my neighbor's yard, and he has a fence here. So what I want to do is indicate that there is a fence here, and you can do this however way you feel comfortable. I could do X's again if I wanted to. I'm actually going to do this by just kind of drawing a straight line down. You could shade that out if you wanted to, but that's indicating that that's my neighbor's fence. Now, so I've got my bed, I've got my neighbor's fence. That's not the only bed I have in the yard. I have an actual house on the left-hand side of mine. So I'm going to draw my house that sticks out a little bit further, obviously. And then I've got a chimney that bumps out. So, not the greatest artist, guys. I apologize. If you're a better artist, props to you. You can do whatever makes it easy for you to understand. But this is my house. So now I've got my garden bed, my Rose of Sharon, my house here. I've also got another bed running around here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that in now. Again, it's roughly about 3 foot deep. So I'm going to measure that out, draw that line. And I'm going to go ahead and indicate that here on paper. Now that bed doesn't run all the way down to the full length of my garden. So it actually stops before that chimney, and I know that. This bump out is a chimney. So I've only drawn it to right there. And then it actually, in the very front of my garden, I have a fence and a gate. So I'm going to draw that. It's a little fence I built. And I'm going to draw that. And they both come into, both of that fence actually butts into my greenhouse. My greenhouse is dead center. So I want to draw my greenhouse. Now, I know the measurements of my greenhouse are a 8 by 6. So I can easily, by doing the math, I said 1 inch equaled 2 feet. So that would be 3 inches would be the opening of my greenhouse. So, and that is at the very front of my garden is the opening. The actual fence that I built butts right into it. So I can measure the center of my garden and just say, okay, it's roughly dead center. I'm going to do a 4 to 7 there, and that is going to be my greenhouse. And then I know that that actually is 8 foot deep, so I'm going to do my lines here, 4 and 7, and then 8 foot would be 4 inches because 1 inch is 2 feet. So that equals there and equals there. So again, I mean, this is just the mapping out of my garden, guys, and the reason that I'm doing it this way is so that I know where my beds are, so that I can start to detail in where all my crops are. And I'm drawing the objects like my greenhouse, like my house, like these fences, like the Rose of Sharon, because each one of those items casts shade. So I need to know what plants are going to be shaded and what time of day. So, believe it or not, every item in your yard casts a shade. So you need to know where the sun is hitting your yard. So now I've got a fence running here, a fence running here, and then this bed, to finish it off, does not run here. It runs the pathway length, which I'd say is about 2 feet, and then it returns back. So I'd say that's about 2 feet. Turns back. So I have a pathway that I've built in. I think the pathway is roughly about 2 feet wide. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in my pathway, and that's going to help identify the rest of my beds that I have kind of in a U shape around my greenhouse. So pathway is about 2 foot wide. Turn this down. Bear with me as I finish this drawing, guys. Wanted to do it all on camera so you guys could kind of get the scope of what I'm working with. Okay, so this is not perfectly to scale. I wish it were better, but roughly, I mean, some of you guys have seen my videos before. This particular bed is only about 3 foot, so I'm not really sure what's going on here. I've obviously misjudged my drawing a little bit, but it's okay. I got the idea. I know this bed in particular is all strawberries, so I'm just going to go ahead and write in strawberries. I know that they are growing in year over year. They're spreading. I have gotten them more and more, propagated new ones. I have a video on that you can check out and show how to transplant strawberries from runners. So I know that this one is all filling in with strawberries. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that in. I usually use dead space for extra. Sometimes I'll do like last year I did eggplant. I won't be doing that this year. Year before that I had done some beans in here as well. So, but I know this one's strawberries. I'm not that worried about it. This here is the pathway leading into my garden against the neighbor's fence. Pathway running all the way down. Pathway to here. So this all is garden space. So now I have my garden space mapped out. I'm just going to go ahead and make some X's across my pathway just to kind of, you could draw in the detail of the bricks if you wanted to. This is your garden path, so remember, you can make this as detailed or not as you want. So clearly I'm sure my garden path is probably maybe wider than 2 feet, and that's probably the issue. If I had exact measurements, that'd be better. I'm going to write GH for greenhouse in here. I know my strawberries are there. Okay. So here's my garden beds. This particular area is, right now, the next step you would think is, all right, let's start detailing out where we want to put our plants. But the next step is actually to understand how the sun works. So this, as I said, is my house. So I know that my house, a 2-story house, is going to cast shade. Well, now I need to know which way the sun rises. Well, in the beginning of spring and through summertime, more and more, is going to rise in the east, obviously, always in the east, but it's going to be high in the sky more often through the summer. So I know that my greenhouse actually faces east. So this is east. So I'm going to go ahead and write east. And then in particular, this is going to be west, south, and north, right? So I'm going to write those in because that helps me understand my directions and which way the sun's moving. So if my sun is rising in the east, it's coming up, I got midday sun is hitting everything all at once, and then the western sun is falling down here. So this whole row is going to get probably shaded in the morning, but at night, late into the evening, the sun sets around 9 o'clock in the summertime. This is going to get great sun unless I block it with this chain link fence. If I put something on there, shade cloth or a crop that covers the whole fence, that's going to create a lot of shade. My house, on the other hand, is not going to be blocking much except for when the sun is peeking up in the morning. It may, depending on the season, it's going to cast shadow, or the time of the season, it's going to cast shadows. So, but this greenhouse is going to cast shadows over this area in the morning because this is the back of the greenhouse. It's blocking this area. Believe it or not, this whole area is blocked by, in the morning, by this fence. It hits midday sun, and then it is actually shaded late into the evening. So this is a very shady area. Tried to grow squashes and melons in here typically, and it does okay, but it's not a great area. In fact, I should have extended my pathway longer, and I may do that this season. We'll see. This area does get the overhang from the roof, so it actually hits shade most of the time, and I only get about half the bed. So I'm just detailing all this out to explain to you guys that it's important to know where those shades are. These 2 rows of Sharons are bushy, and I pruned them back this year, but they cast shadows over this area and this area, and then this one's smaller, but it still casts a shadow here and here. So I've really only got this middle part, this part in the later evening, which again is okay because I get about 8 hours of sun. These are all strawberries. This I've grown onions and carrots in because of the partial shade, and this I've grown melons in. But then we got to get in this area. I usually grow my tomatoes in this area. I grow my peppers and my cucumbers in. I know these because these are what I've done in the past, and they've all done very well. But that was last year. So now let's start detailing out, assuming that I was going to do crop rotation. Why is it important to do crop rotation? So the soil itself, right? So if this is your first year planting, right, understand how big is your bed? Let me take a step back. I'll talk about crop rotation in a second. But let's talk about planting. Now that I understand how my shade works, now that I know where the sun's coming from, where it's setting at, where my bed placement is, where I know all that is, now I need to talk about what plants could I put there based on the bed size. So we talked about this particular bed behind my greenhouse is where I typically do my tomatoes. Well, if I'm going off of this, I'm going to assume my measurement is 6 feet wide by 4 foot deep. And believe it or not, that's about accurate for what that bed size is. Now, if I look at, these are just some simple cherry tomato seeds that I have. If I look at the spacing on the back of them, let's see if I can make sure that that is in focus for you. Try to get that in focus here for you. I apologize. There we go. So I know it's backwards, but if you can see that there, the spacing is this column here, and it is saying 3 foot by 2 foot. So what it's telling me that if I want, my rows need to be 3 foot wide, and my actual plant spacing needs to be 2 foot wide. So when I'm looking at spacing for cherry tomatoes, it's recommending that I only do, well, based on the measurements, 6 foot by 2 foot, I shouldn't do more than 2 to 3 plants max in this section on a diagonal. So that's like saying, okay, in this section I should do 1 here, 1 here, 1 here. Now that's going to space me out properly. I'm going to be roughly 3 foot in between my rows and 2 foot spacing. Now I will tell you that I don't necessarily follow that exact spacing. I've done 4 plants, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then another 4 plants of beefsteak tomatoes here, and it's worked out perfectly. But it is hard to get in there and prune and do what you need to do. With proper pruning, that's not necessarily 100% accurate, but that's what you want to go off of. Let's take a look at another one. These are some Greek hot peppers here, and if I'm reading the spacing on the back of these ones, 18 to 24 inches. So again, 18, so 1.5 to 2 feet, right? Or again, some beefsteak variety tomatoes, 2 foot by 2 foot. So they don't require the exact same spacing as the cherry tomatoes do. So that's very important when you're mapping out your garden. That's why you want to know how big your beds are. If you have a raised bed, great, you know how big it is. which section you're going to put it in. So now that I know this is 6 foot by 4 foot, I know that, okay, here's, according to the package, here's how many plants I should put in this area. And here, my peppers, where I typically put peppers before, okay, I know that I could put my peppers as they need to be 18 inches apart. So I can do that here. Make sense? Shading is very important there because I need to know, can this plant handle shade? Well, let's see. It says actually generally on the back of the package, sunny location 6 weeks prior to the warm letter, transplant outdoors in full sun when seedling display 4 to 6 leaves. So this particular one requires full sun. So what does full sun mean? Well, on a tomato, usually 8 to 12 hours would be fantastic. I say 6 to 8 minimum. That is how you get your tomatoes to ripen quite well. Again, sunny location for this tomato. Well, pepper, it says move to shelter, well-lighted area about 8 weeks. You know, it actually doesn't say, but it will tell you peppers require full sun. They like heat. So, there you go. Interesting. But read your packages on your, if you don't know, or if you got a package, your friend gave you seeds, go online, do some research, look up the variety of crop you're looking at. You're specifically looking for spacing, as well as you're looking for any type of sun. So that's how you help plan your crops. First, you need to know what crops you're planning to set, and then hopefully you have your seed packets. Point out something else really neat with these particular seed packets. In this particular one, it says it's container friendly. So those of you who are choosing to do container gardening like we spoke about, it also tells you that the container needs to be at least a 12-inch container. So it tells you the container size. So that's really cool. This is the hot peppers. So if you're planning on doing some container planting, this is a great thing to be looking for on the back of your seed packets, whereas the beefsteak tomato doesn't say that, and neither does the cherry tomato. But I will tell you, you can do them, but they require much larger containers, like a 5-gallon bucket, for example. Okay, so that's for those first-time gardening that you may be looking at as, sorry, let's get some of that white off of there. I apologize. So that's for that first-time container gardening, guys. Or not container gardening, but first-time gardening, planting your garden for the first time. For those of you who gardened last year, you may have success. You understand the shadowing. You understand your garden placement, what you did last year. Let me help you understand why it may not be a good idea to plant them in the exact same place. Now, for 2 years in a row now, I've done my tomatoes here and my cucumbers along this fence, because my fence is a natural trellis for the cucumbers to go ahead and climb up that chain link fence. It works great if you have one. I recommend it. It's really cool to see them actually climbing the fence, so on and so forth. But this year, why would I consider not doing that? And here's why I would consider not doing that. Because what happens is every year your crops actually use the nutrients in the soil. Certain plants, like tomatoes, use a certain type of nutrient or ingredient in the soil that they are absorbing from that soil. So if you don't replenish that with new soil, new compost, different fertilizers, so on and so forth, if you don't amend that soil with other backfilling some of those things, then unfortunately that will get depleted, and what that'll happen, it can lead to easier disease because the roots don't intake what they need, so they're not great at fighting off diseases. It also lower yield or lower production of your crops because they're not getting all the full items and things that they need. Now there are other plants that you would want to rotate in that position. So potatoes, beans, peas, things like that, they give off, some of them give off different nitrates or give off different materials into the soil, so that way it replenishes them so that the next year. So that's what crop rotation is all about. I'm not going to get into a ton of details in this video in particular, but I wanted to just explain that a little bit, and so you guys could do some research on crop rotation and why it's important. It is important for you to have healthy plants long term. Now, if you've completely redone your garden, you've resoiled it, like I did last year, I dumped a bunch of new soil, I brought in soil, I actually mixed that in with already existing soil, and I mixed in leaves and dried dead leaves, mulch, things like that. So I had a different soil composition last year than I did the year before. So when you're doing things like that, it's okay to plan to put the crops in the same spot. Strawberries, on the other hand, they are ones that are going to grow and spread year over year and take over those areas. But even those are recommended to change beds after about 3 years. So something like that to keep in mind. Only things that are perennials that you would keep in place are items that are year after year, like asparagus is one that you wouldn't just dig up and move in particular. There are rosemary and different herbs that may seed themselves in the same spot year over year that you typically wouldn't dig up and move to a different location on the new year. So those are type of things, but like I said, we're not going to get into that a whole lot today, but I just wanted to touch on that a little bit here for you. So let's talk about actually planting your garden. So I'm going to plan my garden for you just like I did last year as far as location, so that you can kind of see how I do it. So I'm going to start by adding circles to where my plants would go. So as I said, I know I can get about 8 tomato plants in here. I know. Now let's go with what this says. So this spacing here says I should plant my plants in 2 to 3 foot rows, 2 foot apart. So 3 foot rows would mean I would look at my rows long way since it's 6 foot. So I should have 2 rows, so I can get 4 plants in this section. Now I'm going to stagger this and actually do it on a diagonal. And the reason for that is that it would allow me to get more plants in less space. So if I measure on a diagonal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say tomato. I'm going to put a small circle to where I would plant my tomato plant. Now, I don't want it overhanging my pathway much because tomatoes will fall and actually drop seeds into the pathway. I have dug up seeds, actual vines out of my pathway and transplanted them. I think I have a video on that, container video on that. So I'm going to put a circle here and a circle here. And then I'm going to say we're going to do a 3rd cherry tomato there. And then I want beefsteak tomatoes as well. And those are 2 foot by 2 foot. So I'm actually going to do this in a way that is circle, circle, circle. So now I'm going to say CT for cherry tomato and then beefsteak. So I'm going to say BS. Yes, I know. Don't mind my shorthand. So what I've done there, you can see I'm going to do 6 plants. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now on the diagonal, I'm getting more. I've still got my spacing here. I've still got my spacing between here. And I've still got my spacing between here. And I've got it here. When you do things on a diagonal like that, it allows for more spacing in between crops and gets more in that area. Now, it will make it more difficult for me to do my string method staking, which I will link that video in the description at the end here or below. And so, but I'll have to put 3 rows instead of 2 rows, but that's okay. Now, if you look at this, it feels like a lot of wasted space. We've got 3 foot or 4 foot across by 6 foot across, and it's starting to feel like I'm wasting. There's a lot of dead space underneath this plant. So now I need to start thinking about what else can go in this bed with my tomatoes. Nothing, right? Tomatoes grow tall, they get shady. There's really nothing that I can go underneath my tomatoes, right? Wrong. Companion planting. Companion planting is the best thing for your garden, right? So now I can start saying, and I do have a video on that. I'll link it up at the end here and also in the description below. But now I can start looking at, okay, what else can go on my bed? Well, basil. basil goes great with tomato, right? That's not just an Italian dish, it's basil and tomatoes that go hand in hand. Well, they're also great companion plants for each other because basil helps keep pests away from your tomato, as well as it doesn't require as much sunlight to grow, and it also gives off some of those byproducts that the tomato plant really needs. So it is actually very helpful. So how about I throw some basil in there? Well, I don't have the seed packet to say Basil spacing, but I want to say it's roughly about 6 inches apart. That's probably extreme. It's probably only 2 inches apart. But let's say underneath my beefsteak tomatoes, I want to do a handful of basil plants. Well, they're smaller, so I'm just going to make rows. Let's say I like to cook with basil, so I want to do 2 rows, 2 inches apart. And I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 plants of basil. So boom. All right, 12 basil plants. Let me write that in there. Okay. So I've got my basil plants. I've got my tomatoes. Well, what else goes really well with these in particular tomatoes? Well, actually, believe it or not, carrots. Carrots are a great one. They're a root crop, so they grow straight down into the soil. They don't come up. They don't take room above the plant much. They do, the carrot tops do, but they're not really in the way. And carrots don't like a lot of direct sunlight. They do like sun, but not direct sunlight. So tomato plants actually help create a lot of shade for carrots. So I'm going to go ahead and say, you know, we're a carrot family. My son has actually gotten really into carrots lately, so I'm just going to load a bunch of carrots. Carrots are another one that actually need to be direct sown into. They're not one that transplant well, so these are great starters underneath. So the soil doesn't get dried out as much because you're getting a lot of shade. So a good way to start carrots is by putting like a board on top or something like that. So I'm just going to load in as many rows of carrots. I'm just putting a lot of dots here to say this is how many rows of carrots that I want, so on and so forth. So now underneath here, I've got all these dots. I know it's really hard to see, but I've got all these dots there. That's to indicate carrots. So I'm going to write carrots in there. So you guys are understanding the idea, right? So now, right, I know that I can do basil in here, I can do carrots in here. Now I'm actually giving back to the plant, and I'm also using more space in my garden very quickly, not wasting that space, even though I have a larger plant that takes up a lot more room. So there you have it, guys. I'm going to go on and finish out mapping my garden. I'm not going to do it the whole time with you on here, but I did want to just kind of show you a way to map out your garden. I would recommend drawing out the shading. So for example, let me show you what that looks like here. So I'm going to say that the sun itself, and especially in the late evening, especially in the fall itself, because the sun starts to go towards the south, so southwest is where in the fall or winter, that's where it starts to fall. So I know that in particular the house costs on the south side really causes a lot of shade. So you would do something like this to indicate the shading and really understand, and you should do that really for, you know, everything that you're dealing with, and understand the shade that actually happens there. So my rows of sharing causes shade here, my house causes shade here, the fence line causes shade there. It's really important to map out not only where your bed is, but also where your plants are going to go, how the shading is going to go. Understand, and it may be the first year you just try it. You don't actually know, but you watch that through the season. Understand as the sun rises and sets throughout the day. Maybe you're watching it now as the winter is still in play, and you're kind of watching how it's going. But keep in mind, as the season progresses, that will shift further and further from the north, from the south, and so on and so forth. So just keep that in mind, guys. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this video. I know we touched on a couple of different topics: companion planting, a big one, understanding how to map your garden, also in particular crop rotation. So There are a few things that are very important: seed spacing and how much sun they need. There's a lot that goes into planting your garden. Try not to get overwhelmed. It's really important that you just take it one step at a time and have fun with it. To me, this is fun. Mapping it out on a grid paper would be ideal if you have it laying around. It is really fun to map out your garden and understand. The best part of this is I can erase it all and start over, right? There's nothing set in stone, but once I get the plants outside and they're seeded, that's set in stone. You can't just move plants around. You'll cause transplant shock, so on and so forth. So this is a great way to start and understand where you want your plants to go. If you can, get outside with a tape measure, measure it first. This can be done in a day, but then you can sit here. Last year when I mapped up my garden, I actually kept this around for about 2 weeks, looked at it every day, pulled it out and said, all right, is that going to work? Is that what I want? Do I still like this plant? And as I was starting my seedlings indoor, I started them based off my plans for this. The other thing to keep in mind, I forgot to mention in this video, but I'd be hard pressed not to, is succession planting. Where are you going to put your lettuces? Well, after your lettuces, when it gets warmer, they bolt and go to seed. So then you pull them out and you start something else in that spot, like carrots can go in there for a short season, radishes can go for another stint, so on and so forth. And then in the fall, you can replant your lettuces or your greens again. So that's called succession planting. Are you going to do that anywhere? Where is that going to go? Are you going to do succession planting? Plan that out on this piece of paper too. Don't just stick out, what are you going to start with first? Are you going to have an area that's dedicated just to succession planting, for example? So a lot in this video to take in, guys. Please like this video. Leave comments down below if you've got any questions. I'll do my best to answer them all for you. As always, guys, if you want to see more content like this, hit subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you'll be reminded when that content comes. As always, guys, stay safe and enjoy your gardens.